Hello boys and girls and Cougar parents. Today's video will deal with integers. I noticed on the last quiz that you guys have the concept of doing the inverse operation down pretty well. I think you're close to mastering that and ready to move on to multi-step equations. But the one thing that popped up was some confusion about how to handle integers, how to add and subtract, multiply and divide positive and negative numbers. So I hope with this video that we can remove some of the confusion and clear up some things so that we can move on to higher levels of success. Let's take a look at some sample problems, and I'm going to model a few things for you. Boys and girls, let's take a moment to look at this graphic. I found this graphic to be very interesting. It uses color and size to represent positive and negative integers, and when we add them together, what happens? Red represents our positive numbers, and blue represents our negative integers. And here, for example, this graphic here, we see two small positive numbers. Let's say 3 plus 2. Those are two relatively small integers, and when I add these two positive integers together, what happens? I get a larger positive integer. So when you add two small integers together, we just get a larger positive integer. We've worked with those numbers our entire math career so far. And then we got to middle school and they throw in negatives. We're like, what in the world do we do with these? Well, pretty much the same thing. If I have two relatively small negative numbers, such as, let's take negative 5 plus a negative 6, when I take two negative numbers and I add them together, what happens is I get a larger negative, or I have more negatives. I get a negative 11. Now, technically, okay, a negative 11 is smaller, okay, but the absolute value of this number is larger. So think of it this way. When you have two negatives, okay, what you're really doing is I have 5 negatives and then I add 6 more negatives. Now I have 11 negatives altogether. It's very important that you understand the relationship between these numbers. Otherwise, you end up just memorizing a bunch of meaningless rules that can be quite cumbersome. But when you look at this, you're adding two negatives, whether it's money or numbers. I mean, you could say I borrowed $5 on Tuesday and then I borrowed $6 on Wednesday. Now I owe $11 altogether. Okay, so there's real-world application for this, most definitely. Okay, and now we're going to be working with positive and negative numbers, adding them together. If I have a large, or at least a large positive number, say 10, and I add a smaller negative number to it, you might be saying all negative numbers are smaller than positives. That's true. That's true. But what I mean is the absolute value. Say 3, okay, negative 3. What's going to happen? I'm going to end up with a positive 7. See, with the influence, this smaller negative number, okay, I have less negatives, is going to pull down the value of this larger positive number. It's really, I'm just really subtracting. Adding a negative is the same thing as just subtracting. 10 minus 3 gives me 7. But when we look at it, if I have 10 positives and 3 negatives, the 3 negatives will take away 3 positives from my 10, and I'll be left with 7 positives. Okay, so when we have a large positive and a smaller negative, and we add the two together, my answer is going to be positive, but it's going to be smaller than my original negative number. Then I have let's say I have a small positive number, and then I add a larger negative number to it. What's my answer going to be? Well, it's going to be negative, okay, because I have more negatives than I do positives. Okay, and what I'm going to be left with is a negative 11. See, I have 13 negatives and 2 positives. The 2 positives will take away 2 of my negatives and leave me with 11 negatives. So what you really do, anytime you're adding a positive to a negative or a negative to a positive, the first thing you want to ask is, which of my original numbers has a larger absolute value? If I have more positives than negatives, my answer is going to be positive. If I have more negatives than positives, like the second example, then my answer is going to be negative. And what you are always going to do is you're going to find the difference between the two. Okay? And once you find that difference, that will be your answer. And whichever you had more of, whether it was more negatives or more positives, that will determine what the sign of your answer will be. Now let's deal with subtraction. Now subtraction is a little more complex because subtraction, especially when we have a double negative, such as these second examples here, when you subtract a negative, this subtraction sign it actually causes it to do the opposite. Okay, but let's look at the basics. Okay, now we're used to seeing our normal positive numbers subtracted by another positive number, such as 5 minus 3. That's no problem. That's 2. And we had problems like this all through elementary school, where the first number is the larger and we're taking a smaller number away from it, and it leaves us with a positive number. But then once again we came to middle school, and then our teachers started throwing stuff at us like this, 3 minus 5. And some of us, our minds exploded, and we said, we can't take 5 away from 3. That's impossible. You can't take a larger number away from a smaller number. Well, Americans do it all the time. It's called debt. We might only have $3, but that doesn't stop us from spending $5. And when we do that, what happens is we're in debt, or we have a negative amount of money, which in this case would be a negative 2. Okay, if you only have $3, but you spend 5, you spend the 3 you have, and then you're borrowing 2 more, which leaves you with negative $2. Okay, and I think you understand that by now. Okay, so we can take larger numbers, we can subtract larger numbers from smaller numbers, and we're going to get a negative answer. Let's say that we take 2 negative numbers and we subtract them from each other. Well, if I have a negative 7 and I subtract a negative 3, okay, now the only way I can subtract a negative 3 is by adding. And we'll go back to our money, and what happens is a double negative becomes a positive. Okay, it really becomes a positive. So this is negative 7 plus 3, which would be a negative 4. It would be a negative 4. It'd be like if you owed $7 and someone says, well, I want to take away $3 of your debt. What's the only way they could take away $3 of your debt? It would be by giving you $3. Okay? Let's say you're in a hole that's 7 feet deep. Okay? And I wanted to take away 3 feet of that hole. The only way you can take away a hole is by filling it in with dirt. So I'd have to fill it in with 3 feet of dirt. I'd still have a hole, okay, but it wouldn't be as deep. Okay, so that's what happens with, we call this a double negative. You're subtracting a negative, and the only way you can subtract a negative is by adding. Okay, and we have another problem. Let's say we have negative 3 minus a negative 7. Again, we have a double negative. The only way you can take away a negative 7 is by adding 7. So now I have a negative 3 plus 7. This time my answer would be a positive 4, because I'd be able to take away the 3 negatives by adding 3, but I'd still have 4 left to add. Okay, now let's say I have a large positive and I'm subtracting a smaller negative. Again, we're just dealing with a double negative. So I've got 10, and I want to take away negative 4. The only way I can take away a negative 4 is by adding 4. So 10 plus 4 is 14. And then down here I have 4 minus a negative 10. The only way I can take away a negative or subtract a negative is by adding it. So 4 plus 10 is also 14. And the only other combination you might see is, let's say I have a negative number, let's say negative 5, and I want to subtract a negative 3. Well, in that case, again, I have a double negative. Okay, so it's a negative 5 plus 3, which would leave me with a negative 2. You might also have, let's say, a negative 3 minus a negative 5. And if that happens, okay, again, the only way, double negative, the only way you can subtract a negative is by adding. So it would be a negative 3 plus 5, which would give me a positive 2. Let's take a look at multiplying integers. Now, multiplication and division is pretty simple. It comes down to this basic rule. If the signs are the same, your answer is going to be positive. If you're multiplying 2 positives, your answer is going to be a positive answer. And if you're multiplying 2 negative numbers, the answer is going to be positive as well. The only thing that changes when you have different signs, then your answer will always be negative, whether you're multiplying or dividing. For example, 3 times 5 is a positive 15. But if I were to take a negative, and a negative 3 times a negative 5 would also be a positive 15. Okay? But if I had a positive 5 and I multiplied it by a negative 3, my answer is going to be a negative 15. If I have a positive 3 and I multiply it by a negative 5, my answer will still be a negative 15, because when I multiply two integers that have different signs, if there's a different sign, my answer is going to be negative. If my two signs are the same, whether they're both positive or both negative, my answer is going to be positive. And the same is true of division. If I have 15 divided by 3, I'm going to get a positive 5 as my answer. If I have a negative 15 divided by a negative 3, my answer is still going to be a positive 5. If I have a positive 15 divided by a negative 3, my answer is going to be a negative 5. And if I have, this would be interesting, let's say I have a positive 5 and I divide it by a negative 10, okay, my answer is going to be a negative 1/2 or a negative 5/10. Because when your signs are the same, when you multiply and divide, your answer will be positive. When your signs are different, when you multiply and divide, your answer will always be negative. As always, boys and girls, I hope that was helpful, and if you have any questions, please bring them to class tomorrow. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.